Why don't we know anything about Jesus' childhood? Why didn't they write it down until 40 years after he had died? Honey, there is so much context back then that no longer applies to today. Today's thinking's got to change. So let's put it in context. Why don't we know anything about his childhood? Well, that's the way biographies were written back then. Why wasn't anything written down until 40 years after he had died? Has something to do with the literacy rate back then. I sat down with Dr. Daryl Bach. I asked him all the questions about Jesus, about his childhood, about why it wasn't written down, and this is what he said. I want to get more into like why there is limited information. Now that we kind of understand his formative years, the gospels themselves are like portraits, vignettes. They're not like full traditional biographies that we're used to. Why do you think John the Beloved loves Jesus, probably knows his childhood stories? Why didn't you like? Why wouldn't he have included everything about the guy that he loves so much,
Well,
like a
it's a
full,
good
like a
question.
biographical timeline?
Yeah, because we don't, our biography, which goes into that, is not ancient biography. Ancient biography tells a story for the examples that it represents, and they don't necessarily dive into the background of what took the person there. So you don't get that kind of material. Ancient biography is interested in what someone's life and example is like, but they aren't interested, like I said, in what took them there, what form, the idea of what
Oh.
formed them to make them to that person. That ancient biographies, generally speaking, don't do that. They're interested in
They
what the
don't include
person
the
said.
background.
No, oftentimes they don't. They just want to know
Oh.
this is what the person said or did that's worth emulating. That's what they
Mm.
were focused on. So that's why you get what you get. And another feature to think about is why did it take 40 years to write a gospel? Why didn't they write a gospel immediately about Jesus? And the answer to that question is in the ancient world, it was an oral world. It wasn't primarily a written world. In fact, the argument is about 10 to 15% of the population is literate. Everyone else can't read or write.
Got
So
it.
and writing something down on papyrus was expensive. It was an activity for the elite, and so you don't write it down, etc. Everything that gets passed on in an ancient world, in an oral world, is passed on orally. And the belief was it's more important to hear the living voice of someone who experienced this than it is to see it written down on a piece of paper, on a piece of papyri. So you don't get the gospels until you start to lose the living voices and witnesses to what took place. So that's why, so it took, once you start to lose the living voices, the eyewitnesses who were respected and regarded for telling the story, and they were starting to drop off the scene, someone came to the view of saying, we better record this.